What if the most significant weapon in this war was never in the air? What if it was waiting in the water, somewhere off the coast of southern Iran, in the black water outside Bandar Abbas? Something moved across the surface of the Persian Gulf that had never been used in American combat before. No pilot inside it. No crew standing by to bring it home. Just a machine built to go in once, hit its target, then never come back. And when the sun came up over the Strait of Hormuz that morning, a piece of Iran's naval infrastructure that had stood 4 years was gone, and a new chapter in American warfare had quietly been written. This is a story of the weapon Iran never saw coming, and the week that changed how the United States fights at sea. To understand how big this moment actually is, you need to understand exactly where things stood in the days leading up to it. For most of the past year, the world has been watching a war that many people assumed had already ended. Back in the spring, after weeks of American airstrikes against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure, the two sides signed a memorandum of understanding. It was supposed to be the off-ramp, 60 days of calm, a chance for Iran to prove it could behave like a responsible actor in one of the most important waterways on Earth, and a chance for the United States to pull back from a war that had already stretched its forces across the region for months. For a while, it looked like it might hold. Then, on July 6, that fragile peace started to come apart. Iran's Revolutionary Guard forces struck 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, including a tanker carrying liquefied natural gas. Iran's government claimed the ships had ignored warnings and were using unauthorized routes. The truth was simpler and uglier. Iran had found a clause in the agreement it signed day line about ensuring safe passage for commercial vessels and twisted it into something it was never meant to be. In Tehran's new interpretation, safe passage meant Iranian forces got to decide which ships could move and which ones couldn't. If a ship didn't check in with Iran first, it became a target. President Trump's response was immediate and blunt. He told reporters the ceasefire was finished. Within days, United States Central Command launched what would become a string of retaliatory strikes, each one bigger than the last. The first night hit around 80 targets. The second night, 90th by the fourth wave, the number of targets struck across the week had climbed past 300, spanning missile sites, radar installations, ammunition depots, drone launch facilities, and fast attack boat bases scattered along Iran's southern coastline. And then, on the night of July 11, something different happened. Something that had never happened before in the history of American military operations. For the first time ever, the United States used uncrewed surface vessels, sometimes called sea drones or drone boats, as an actual strike weapon in combat. 3 of them, built by a company called Saronic and known by the name Corsair, slipped into the waters near Bandar Abbas naval base under cover of darkness. Their target, a submarine and ship maintenance facility, a place Iran used to service and repair the small, fast attack craft it relies on to threaten shipping in the strait. These boats weren't there to patrol or observe. They weren't there to come home. Each one carried a payload of explosives, and each one was on what the military calls a 1-way mission. Once it launched, there was no recall button. It was going to hit something, or it was going to fail trying. It didn't fail. CENTCOM confirmed the strike the following morning in a short but historic statement. Using multiple 1-way attack surface drones, the command said its forces had successfully struck the submarine and ship maintenance facility, describing it as the first time American forces had ever employed sea drones in combat operations. In 11 words, an era of naval warfare quietly closed, and another opened. Now, if you've been following the war closely, you might be wondering why this is such a big deal. After all, the United States has been using aerial drones in this fight for months. Reaper drones, 1-way attack drones modeled loosely on Iran's own Shahed design. Even a low-cost system called Lucas that mimics the silhouette of the very weapon Iran uses to terrorize Ukrainian and Gulf cities alike. Drones in the air are old news at this point. But drones on the water used specifically to deliver a lethal payload into an enemy target, that's a genuinely new frontier for the United States military. And the story of how it got here says a lot about how modern warfare has changed in just the last few years. To understand where this technology came from, you have to go back to a war that, on paper, has nothing to do with Iran at all. Ukraine. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine has faced an opponent with one of the largest navies in the world and almost no navy of its own to fight back with. What Ukraine did instead was improvise. Engineers and volunteers built small, fast and manned boats back with explosives. Essentially, floating bombs that could be steered remotely at high speed toward Russian warships. They were cheap. They were expendable. and they worked far better than almost anyone expected. Ukrainian Sea drones have been credited with sinking or severely damaging numerous Russian vessels in the Black Sea, including warships worth many times more than the drones that took them out. It became one of the most lopsided cost exchanges of the entire war. A handful of thousands of dollars in hardware disabling ships that cost tens or even hundreds of millions to build. The United States Navy noticed. So did defense planners worried about a much bigger, much more distant threat: China's rapidly expanding fleet in the Pacific. If a relatively small, resource-strapped country like Ukraine could humble part of a major navy using cheap and manned boats, what could a country with the industrial and technological resources of the United States build if it took the same idea seriously? That question set off roughly 2 years of accelerated development inside the Pentagon. Now let's talk about what actually happened during the strike itself. The target wasn't a random patch of coastline. It was a submarine and ship maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas Naval Base, one of Iran's most significant naval installations, sitting right along the Strait of Hormuz. This is the kind of facility that keeps a fleet running. It's where damaged vessels get patched up, where fast attack boats get serviced between operations, where the physical backbone of Iran's ability to harass shipping in the strait gets maintained. Hitting a target like this isn't about a single dramatic explosion. It's about degrading Iran's capacity to sustain its naval harassment campaign over the long term. You can replace a boat. It's much harder and much slower to replace the infrastructure that keeps an entire fleet operational. This is exactly the vulnerability that made Ukraine's sea drone campaign against Russia's Black Sea Fleet so devastating. And it's exactly the vulnerability the United States appears to be exploiting now against Iran's naval forces in the Gulf. Here's what we know from CENTCO's own statements. The strike wasn't just sea drones acting alone. The operation combined fighter aircraft, naval vessels, 1-way attack aerial drones, and for the first time, 1-way attack sea drones, all working together as part of a single coordinated effort. Think of it less like one weapon doing all the work and more like an orchestra, each instrument playing a specific role. Fighter jets and suppression aircraft working to clear or confuse enemy air defenses and striking targets that require speed and range. Aerial drones handling other categories of targets, often ones where risking a manned aircraft doesn't make sense. And now, sea drones handling the category that used to require either a risky close-minus in naval bombardment or a special forces operation. Targets sitting right at the water's edge, protected as much by geography as by any defense system. For a target like a hardened radar site deep inland, you probably want a precision-guided bomb from a manned aircraft with enough altitude and speed to avoid being an easy target. For a coastal maintenance facility sitting right on the water, a slow, hard -to- detect surface vessel might actually be the safer, smarter choice, because it never has to enter contested airspace at all. It approaches entirely within its own domain, the water, where Iran's air defense network offers it almost no protection whatsoever. That's the quiet genius of this new capability. It doesn't just add another weapon to the arsenal. It closes a gap. Every square mile of the Iranian coastline that used to require either a risky airstrike or an even riskier boots -on-, the water special operation can now potentially be reached by an autonomous vessel that costs a fraction of a manned mission and puts 0 American lives and lives directly at risk during the strike itself. But here is the question that follows. The United States can now strike coastal targets with unmanned vessels. What stops Iran from doing the same? Iran has already used drones extensively in this conflict. They have the technical capability to build similar systems. They have the incentive to develop countermeasures. So the question is not just what the United States can do now. It is what Iran will do in response. Now let's zoom out and look at what this actually means going forward. For decades, naval power has largely meant big, expensive, heavily crewed vessels, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, submarines, ships that take years to build, cost billions of dollars, and put thousands of sailors in harm's way every time they deploy into contested waters. The rise of cheap, autonomous, 1-way attack vessels doesn't replace that traditional navy, at least not anytime soon, but it fundamentally changes the math of naval warfare. A single Iranian fast attack boat, one of the kind Iran has used repeatedly to harass shipping in the strait, can reportedly cost anywhere from several $100,000 to well over $1 million, depending on its configuration. A 1-way attack sea drone built specifically to destroy something like that costs a small fraction of that price, and it never has to survive the mission to be considered a success. This is the same brutal logic that has reshaped modern conflicts from Ukraine to the Red Sea to now the Persian Gulf. Expensive, exquisite platforms are increasingly vulnerable to cheap, numerous, expendable ones. The country that figures out how to build and deploy that cheap, numerous capability at scale gains a serious advantage, especially in contested choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, where geography forces everyone into tight, predictable spaces, and there's a broader strategic story here too. This capability wasn't built with Iran specifically in mind. It was built with an eye toward the Pacific, toward the possibility of a future confrontation involving Chinese naval forces operating across a much larger and more contested body of water. Iran, in that sense, has become something like a live-minus-fire proving ground for a weapons system designed with a much bigger, much more consequential rival in mind. Every lesson learned in the Strait of Hormuz, what works, what doesn't, how these vessels perform in real combat conditions against a real adaptive enemy gets fed back into a program that will likely shape how the United States Navy operates for the next generation. That's a sobering thought. The vessels striking Bandar Abbas this week are, in a very real sense, a preview, a test run for a capability that may end up mattering just as much, if not more, in a completely different part of the world someday. So where does this leave us? The Strait of Hormuz is open, but shipping is slowed to its lowest level in roughly 5 weeks. Iran insists it retains the right to manage traffic through what it considers its territorial waters. The United States insists the strait remains international water, open to all regardless of what Iran claims. Neither side has shown any sign of backing down from that basic disagreement. And that disagreement, more than any single weapon system, is what is actually driving this entire conflict forward. The introduction of sea drones into this fight isn't a one-time novelty. Task Force 59 has been building toward this capability since at least March. The Pentagon evaluated multiple manufacturers specifically to make sure this technology could scale. And CENXC-OM's own language describing this as a new addition to an already expanding strike package strongly suggests this was the beginning of a sustained capability, not a single demonstration meant to send a message and then quietly disappear. If that's true, then the maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas may end up being remembered as the first target in a much longer list. Every submarine pen, every small boat harbor, every coastal repair yard along Iran's southern coastline just became reachable in a way it wasn't a week ago, by a weapon that is quiet, fast, hard to detect, and doesn't ask anyone to risk their life to deliver it. The water itself is no longer neutral ground. And for the first time in American military history, that shift didn't come from a jet, a missile, or a submarine. It came from 3 small boats with nobody on board, moving quietly across the dark, doing exactly what they were built to do. So here is the question that remains. If the United States can now strike any coastal target in Iran with unmanned vessels at a fraction of the cost and risk of traditional naval or air operations, what does that do to the strategic calculus in Tehran? What does it do to Iran's ability to project power through the Strait of Hormuz? And what does it mean for the future of naval warfare everywhere? The weapons we see are only the surface. The systems we don't see the industrial capacity, the autonomy software, the command and control networks are what determine how long those weapons can continue to exist. And right now, off the coast of Iran, a new system has just proven itself in combat. The question is not what happened at Bandar Abbas. The question is what comes next.